Today I'm going to continue reading excerpts from State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin, starting with Supplementary Explanations by Engels. On the question of housing, Lenin writes, "How is the housing question to be settled then? In present-day society, it is settled just as any other social question, by the gradual economic leveling of demand and supply. A settlement which reproduces the question itself again and again, and therefore is no settlement. How a social revolution would settle this question not only depends on the characteristics in each particular case, but is also connected with the much more far-reaching questions, one of the most fundamental of which is the abolition of the antithesis between town and country. As it is not our task to create utopian systems for the organization of future society, it would be more than idle to go into the question here. But one thing is certain, there is already sufficient quantity of houses in the big cities to remedy immediately all real housing shortages, provided they are used judiciously. This can naturally only occur through the expropriation of the present owners and by quartering of their houses homeless workers or workers overcrowded in their present homes. As soon as the proletariat has won political power, such a measure prompted by concern of the common good will be just as easy to carry out as are other expropriations by the present-day state." He quotes Engels. "It must be pointed out that the actual seizure of all of the instruments of labor, the taking possession of industry as a whole by the working people, is the exact opposite of the Proudhonist redemption. In the latter case, the individual workers become the owner of the dwelling, the peasant farm, the instruments of labor. In the former case, the working people remain the collective owners of the houses, factories, and instruments of labor, and will hardly permit their use, at least during the transitional period, by individuals or associations without compensation for the costs. In the same way, the abolition of property in land is not the abolition of ground rent, but its transfer, if in a modified form, to society. The actual seizure of all the instruments of labor by the working people, therefore, does not preclude the retention of rent relations." In continuing to discuss controversy with the anarchists, he writes, quoting Marx, "If the political struggle of the working class assumes revolutionary form," wrote Marx, ridiculing the anarchists for their repudiation of politics, "and if the workers set up their revolutionary dictatorship in place of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, they commit the terrible crime of violating principles, for in order to satisfy their wretched, vulgar, everyday needs, and to crush the resistance of the bourgeoisie, they give the state a revolutionary and transient form, instead of laying down their arms and abolishing the state." Lenin writes, "It was solely against this type of abolition of the state that Marx fought in refuting the anarchists. He did not at all oppose the view that the state would disappear when classes disappeared, or that it would be abolished when the classes were abolished. What he did oppose was the proposition that the workers should renounce the use of arms, organized violence, that is, the state, which is to serve to crush the resistance of the bourgeoisie. We do not, after all, differ with the anarchists on the question of the abolition of the state as the aim. We maintain that, in order to achieve this aim, we must temporarily make use of the instruments, resources, and methods of state power against the exploiters, just as the temporary dictatorship of the oppressed classes is necessary for the abolition of classes." Next, Lenin quotes from Engels' On Authority. "Why do the anti-authoritarians not confine themselves to crying out against political authority, the state? All socialists are agreed that the state, and with it a political authority, will disappear as the result of the coming social revolution. That is, the public functions will lose their political character and become mere administrative functions of watching over social interests. But these anti-authoritarians demand that the political state be abolished in one stroke, even before the social relations that gave birth to it have been destroyed. They demand that the first act of the social revolution shall be the abolishment of authority. Have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? A revolution is certainly one of the most authoritarian things there is. It is an act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon, all of which are highly authoritarian means, and the victorious party must maintain its rule by means of the terror which its rifles inspire in the reactionaries. Would the Paris Commune have lasted more than a day if it had not used the authority of the armed people against the bourgeoisie? Cannot we, on blame it for having made too little use of that authority? Therefore, one of two things is true. Either the anti-authoritarians don't know what they're talking about, in which case they are creating nothing but confusion, or they do know what they're talking about, and in that case they are betraying the cause of the proletariat. In either, they can only serve reaction." Later, on the criticism of the draft of the Erfurt program, Lenin quotes Engels. When we pass from joint stock companies to trust, which assume control over and monopolize whole industries, it is not only private production that ceases, but also planlessness. Here we have what is the most essential theoretical appraisal of the last phase of capitalism, i.e., imperialism, namely that capitalism becomes monopoly capitalism. The latter must be emphasized because of the erroneous bourgeois reformist assertion that monopoly capitalism or state monopoly capitalism is no longer capitalism and can now be called state socialism, and so on. The trusts, of course, never provided, do not now provide, and cannot provide complete planning. But however much they do plan, however much the capitalist magnates calculate in advance the volume of production on a national and even international scale, and however much they systematically regulate it, we still remain under capitalism. At its new stage, it is true, but still capitalism, without a doubt. The proximity of such capitalism to socialism should serve genuine representatives of the proletariat as an argument proving the proximity, facility, feasibility, and urgency of the socialist revolution, and not only as an argument for the tolerating the repudiation of such a revolution and the efforts to make capitalism look more attractive, something which all reformists are trying to do. Lenin goes on to write, Engels particularly stressed the fundamental fact that the German Social Democrats were prompted by fear of the renewal of anti-socialist law and explicitly described it as opportunism. He declared that precisely because there was no republic and no freedom in Germany, the dreams of a peaceful path were perfectly absurd. Engels was careful not to tie his hands. Quote, one can conceive, and Lenin puts in parentheses, only conceive, exclamation point, of a peaceful development towards socialism. Later Lenin writes, accordingly, Engels proposes the following words for the self-government clause in the program. Complete self-government for the provinces, districts, and communes through officials elected by the universal suffrage. The abolition of all local provincial authorities appointed by the state. Lenin writes that he has already had case to point out how our pseudo-socialist representatives of pseudo-revolutionary pseudo-democracy have made glaring departures from democracy. Next, he discusses the 1891 preface to Marx's, quote, The Civil War in France. He writes, in France, Engels observed, the workers emerged with arms from every revolution. Therefore, the disarming of the workers was the first commandment for the bourgeois, who were at the helm of the state. Hence, after every revolution won by the workers, a new struggle, ending with the defeat of the workers. He talks about a would-be Marxist, a Menshevik, who blurted out that the bourgeoisie were determined to disarm the Petrograd workers, presenting, of course, this decision as his own, as a necessity for the state in general. A little later, he writes, and people think they have taken quite the extraordinarily bold step forward when they have rid themselves of belief in hereditary monarchy and swear by the democratic republic. In reality, however, the state is nothing but a machine for the oppression of one class by another, and indeed in the democratic republic no less than the monarchy. And at best, it is an evil inherited by the proletariat after its victorious struggle for class supremacy, whose worst sides the victorious proletariat will have to lop off as speedily as possible, just as the commune had to, until a generation is reared in new, free social conditions and is able to discard the entire lumber of the state. In Overcoming Democracy, he writes, whose ultimate political aim is to overcome the whole state and consequently democracy as well. He goes on, but the question of the name of the party is incomparably less important than the question of the attitude of the revolutionary proletariat to the state. In the usual argument about the state, the mistake is constantly made, against which Engels warned, and which we have in passing indicated above, namely, it is constantly forgotten the abolition of the state means also the abolition of democracy, that withering away of the state means the withering away of democracy. At first sight, this assertion seems exceedingly strange and incomprehensible. Indeed, someone may even suspect us of expecting the advent of a system of society in which the principal subordination of the minority to the majority will not be observed, for democracy means recognition of this very principle. No, democracy is not identical with the subordination of the minority to the majority. Democracy is a state which recognizes the subordination of the minority to the majority, i.e., an organization for the systemic use of force by one class against another. We set ourselves the ultimate aim of abolishing the state, i.e., all organized and systemic violence, all use of violence against people in general. We do not expect that the advent of a system of society in which the principle of subordination of the minority to the majority will not be observed. In striving for socialism, however, we are convinced that it will develop into communism, and therefore that the need for violence against people in general, for the subordination of one man to another, and one section of the population to another, will vanish altogether, since the people will become accustomed to observing the elementary conditions of social life without violence and without subordination. In order to emphasize this element of habit, Engels speaks of a new generation, reared anew, free of social conditions, which will be able to discard the entire lumber of the state, of any state, including the democratic republican state. In order to explain this, it is necessary to analyze the economic basis of the withering away of the state. On the economic basis of the withering away of the state, Lenin writes, "The whole theory of Marx is the application of the theory of the development in its most consistent, most complete, most considered, and pithy form to modern capitalism. Naturally, Marx was faced with the problem of applying his theory both to the forthcoming collapse of capitalism and to the future development of future communism. On the basis of the fact that it has its origins in capitalism, that it develops historically from capitalism, that is the result of the action of a social force which capitalism gave birth, there is no trace of an attempt on Marx's part to make up a utopia, to indulge in idle guessing about what cannot be known. Marx treated the question of communism the same way a naturalist would treat the question of the development of, say, a new biological variety. Once he knew that it had originated in such and such way and was changing in such and such definite direction." He says, "The first fact that has been established most accurately by the new theory of development, by science as a whole, is a fact that was ignored by the utopians and is ignored by the present-day opportunists who are afraid of socialist revolution, is that, historically, there must undoubtedly be a special stage or special phase in the transition from capitalism to communism." On the transition from capitalism to communism, he writes, Marx continued, now quoting Marx, "Between capitalist and communist society lies a period of the revolutionary transformation of one into the other. Corresponding to this, there is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat." Marx bases this conclusion on an analysis of the role played by the proletariat in modern capitalist society, on the data concerning the development of the society, and on the irreconcilability of the antagonistic interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Previously, the question was put as followed. To achieve its emancipation, the proletariat must overthrow the bourgeoisie, win political power, and establish its revolutionary dictatorship. Now the question is put somewhat differently. The transition from capitalist society, which is developing towards communism, to communist society is impossible without a political transition period, and the state in this period can only be the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. What, then, is the relation of the dictatorship to democracy? We have seen that the Communist Manifesto simply places side by side the two concepts, to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class and to win the battle for democracy. On the basis of all that has been said above, it is possible to determine more precisely how democracy changes in the transition from capitalism to communism. In capitalist society, providing it develops under the most favorable conditions, we have more or less complete democracy in the democratic republic. But this democracy is always hemmed in by the narrow limits set by capitalist exploitation, and consequently remains, in effect, a democracy for the minority, only for the property class, only for the rich. Freedom in capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in ancient Greek republics, freedom for the slave owners. Owning the conditions of capitalist exploitation, the modern wage slaves are so crushed by want and poverty that they cannot be bothered with democracy, cannot be bothered with politics. In the ordinary peaceful course of events, the majority of the population is debarred from participation in public and political life. Democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich. That is the democracy of capitalist society. If we look more closely to the machinery of capitalist democracy, we see everywhere, in the petty, supposedly petty details of the suffrage, parentheses, residential qualifications, exclusion of women, etc., in the technique of the representative institutions, in the actual obstacles of the right to assembly, public buildings are not for, quote, paupers, by example, in the purely capitalist organization of the daily press, we see restriction after restriction upon democracy. These restrictions, exemptions, exclusions, obstacles for the poor seem slight, especially in the eye of one who has never known one himself and has never been in close contact with the oppressed classes in their mass life. And 9 out of 10, if not 99 out of 100, bourgeois publicists and politicians come under this category. But in their sum total, these restrictions exclude and squeeze out the poor from politics, from active participation in democracy. Marx grasped this essence of capitalist democracy splendidly when, in analyzing the experience of the commune, he said that the oppressed are allowed once every few years to decide which particular representative of the oppressing class shall represent and repress them in parliament. But from this capitalist democracy, that is inevitably narrow and stealthily pushes aside the poor, and is therefore hypocritical and false through and through, forward development does not proceed simply, directly, and smoothly towards greater and greater democracy, as the liberal professors and petty bourgeois opportunists would have us believe. No, forward development, i.e., development towards communism, proceeds through the dictatorship of the proletariat and cannot do otherwise, for the resistance of the capitalist exploiters cannot be broken by anyone else or in any other way. And the dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e., the organization of the vanguard of oppressed as the ruling class for the purpose of suppressing the oppressors, cannot result merely in the expansion of democracy. Simultaneously with the expansion of democracy, which for the first time becomes democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, not democracy for the moneybags, the dictatorship of the proletariat imposes a series of restrictions on the freedom of the oppressors, the exploiters, the capitalists. We must suppress them in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Their resistance must be crushed by force. It is clear that there is no freedom and no democracy where there is suppression and where there is violence. Democracy for the vast majority of the people, and suppression by force, i.e., exclusion from democracy of the exploiters and oppressors of the people. This is the change democracy undergoes during the transition from capitalism to communism. The expression, quote, "the state withers away," is very well chosen, for it indicates both the gradual and spontaneous nature of the process. Only habit can, and undoubtedly will, have such an effect, for we see around us millions of occasions how readily people become accustomed to observing the necessary rules of social intercourse, when there is no exploitation, when there is nothing that arouses indignation, evokes protests and revolts, and creates the need for suppression. Furthermore, during the transition from capitalism to communism, suppression is still necessary, but it is now suppression of the exploiting minority by the exploited majority. A special apparatus, a special machine for suppression, the state, is still necessary, but this is now a transitional state. It is no longer a state in the proper sense of the word, for the suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of wage slaves of yesterday is comparatively so easy, simple, and natural a task that it will entail far less bloodshed than the suppression of the rising of slaves, serfs, or wage laborers, and it will cost mankind far less. And it is compatible with the extension of democracy to such an overwhelming majority of the population that the need for special machine of suppression will begin to disappear. Naturally, the exploiters are unable to suppress the people without a highly complex machine for performing this task, but the people can suppress the exploiters even with a very simple, quote, machine, almost without a machine, without a special apparatus, by the simple organization of the armed people, such as a Soviet of workers and soldiers' deputies would remark running ahead.